Hello and welcome to another episode of Material Matters with Grant Gibson. I've been doing this for 3 years now, but for listeners who might be new to the show, the idea is that I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. In case you missed the news in the last episode, I thought I ought to mention again that we're going to turn Material Matters into an exhibition this September as part of the London Design Festival. We'll be taking the Barge House at the Oxo Tower Wharf on the South Bank and asking a fistful of companies and agencies to tell visitors how their material will shape our future. It's all very exciting and there'll be more details as the year progresses. So, on with the show. And my guests in this episode, recorded earlier this week, are designers Nipa Doshi and Jonathan Levien. The duo, who also happened to be real-life partners, met while they were both studying at London's Royal College of Art in the late 90s. I first came across their work in 2003 when I saw an extraordinary range of cookware they'd designed for French company Tefal. In terms of form, each item was incredibly precise. However, flip the pots and pans over and on the base was an unexpectedly beautiful pattern. The pieces seemed different and incredibly exciting, a combination of contemporary European design and thinking from somewhere else entirely. Since then, the pair have gone on to work for the likes of Moroso, Hay, Kvadrat, BD Barcelona, Galerie, Kreo, Cappellini, and many others, creating textiles, furniture, glassware, shoes, lighting, and even ice cream that deftly combines their contrasting skills, ideas, and backgrounds. Hello, guys. Thank you very much for doing this.
Hi, Grant.
Was that all reasonably accurate? I'm getting a thumbs up over there.
Good. Okay. You can write for us.
Oh, good. One of the first things we do on this podcast is give listeners a sense of where you work. Maybe could you describe the space we're in? It was originally an 1850s furniture factory, right?
That's right. So our studio is in the heart of Columbia Road, the East End, and that somehow seems to be where we've always worked. It's on the corner. It's a beautiful 1850s furniture factory, which was then occupied by artists, a textile designer, and then we've had it now for the last almost 15 years.
Because you were in Spitalfields before. So what is it about the East End that you find so attractive to work in?
There's something about these old buildings. They were designed really to let in maximum light because they were working spaces. So it's perfect for our work because we use colour a lot and we need good light for that. But there's also something about the kind of rustic nature of these spaces, which allows us to just be really creative and use them as, workshops and just get really kind of messy in our process.
Well, I was going to say, there's making going on here. When we arrived, you were wiping clay from your hands.
That's right.
So making is very important, and being able to make in this space is obviously vital.
Personally speaking, I've always been a maker. I didn't set out with the idea of doing design, actually. I was a cabinet maker at 16. I left school and went to cabinet making school. So I learned to use wood for the first 2 years. And I was making things really well, actually, to perfection. But they lacked a design element. I don't think that I would rate any of the designs of the things I made. But I learned making at a very young age.
Until last week, the subject that's dominated the news agenda was the pandemic. How's it been for you? Did you have lots of work? Has it changed the practice at all?
Of course, we carried on working through the pandemic. In answer to your question, the studio and our space also, it became another space that we could go to and became even more important during the pandemic that we had our studio and we could continue working. We have been busy, of course, and I think the nature of our work is such that it takes projects almost 2 years from start to come to fruition. So in that sense, I think design is quite a slow industry to be in. And fortunately for people in our industry, because people were at home and in indoor spaces, they realized the value of how they live, the spaces that they live in, the pieces that they have. So luckily, I think that it's been all right.
There's one major way in which our process adjusted during the COVID period is that usually we would fly quite a lot to meet our clients. We'd go and make presentations to them. But this time it was our made pieces that were flying and not us. It's a very effective way of presenting an idea to a client. I mean, if you take paper planes, for example, that we made for Moroso, that started life as a cardboard mock-up, with a wood frame. Patrizia Moroso came to our studio and she sat in the chair and she loved it. She loved the sense of space that it created around her. She had a real sense of the object and what it could be. And this was communicated through the made object, which then became industrially produced and is
Right.
still available to buy. So, yeah, this idea that we make something and then it sort of turns into an industrially produced object, I think is an intrinsic part of our process. But yeah, getting back to the question, it's also a very effective way of presenting ideas, that the object speaks for itself.
So you were posting prototypes or
Exactly.
shipping prototypes out
Yes.
to clients.
Exactly.
You weren't with them.
We weren't with them. And they would arrive, they would unpack them, put them together, and we'd get some feedback, and have a conversation.
So can you tell me who you're working for during the pandemic?
It's interesting that as soon as the pandemic, as soon as we went into lockdown, 2 new Italian companies approached us to work with them.
Right.
And one of them we haven't met in person. It's a very well-known Italian brand. And then the other one, we met them twice, and we've developed a whole collection that's going to launch in June. I can't say right now who these people are, but and of course we are working with Hey, with Kvadrat, and all the Tefal and all the other companies that we've had long-standing collaborations with.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating that we did 2 major projects without really meeting the client, and it seems to have worked. I think, of course, slower, much slower. The process has been, it takes longer to look at details on the screen, on the computer, to explain things. But I've kind of enjoyed not traveling wastefully as well. I realize you can do quite a lot of work remotely. When I say remotely, I mean in the studio.
What you can't do, I guess, is understand fully the culture of the company that you're working with, in the way that designers often talk about, going into the factory, understanding how things are put together, understanding the brand's DNA, if you like. Presumably that's much harder over Zoom.
But you have to remember, Grant, that we've been designing things for almost 20 years now. We have been to quite a lot of factories. So there is a kind of intrinsic understanding of how things are made. So unless you're working in a completely new industry where we don't know about the technology, I think that making is such a part of our process that I don't feel I need to go to a factory anymore, though I love to work with craftspeople and the prototypers and the makers to solve problems. But that's kind of at a technical level.
We're nearly in March now. Milan would traditionally be in April, and Milan being the biggest design show, arguably, in the world. It's now taking place in June. You'll be having things there, obviously.
Yes.
Can you tell us what?
No.
Okay, of course, we're going to have some furniture because it's a furniture fair. And it'll be, our first collaboration with this company, a well-known Italian respected company as well. So I think that we're probably only going to have 2 new collections in Milan.
Okay.
Which is also, I think, kind of going back to the pandemic. I think one of the things that Jonathan and I really decided in the last 2.5 years is that it's important to launch fewer collections, but to really launch work that matters to the company that we are working with and to our practice. So this idea of doing lots of pieces for lots of little companies or big brands, I think it felt like we needed to focus on what we are making and what our output is going to be.
It's partly linked to our output and what we're able to put out with the quality that we want to create. And given that our process is largely involving making, it takes time to make things. It's a lot quicker, obviously, to make something on a computer and send it out and work in that way. So there's a lot of refinement that happens in the process. If you look at some of the products that we have in our studio on the walls, you can see that there are many iterations of the mock-ups and the prototypes before we get to presenting something to our clients. The advantage of this process is that there's much less development for them to do, and we cut the time short in the development cycle. But the investment of time is great for us. For each product we do, we commit to it and invest good time in it.
But also I think that even though we've been working for so many years now, we both still love design and we love detail and we are still involved in every aspect of a project. And I think that that's something that neither of us have wanted to give up, this kind of hands-on approach to drawing, making, refining, and that takes time.
How big is the studio now? We have Fiona sitting very quietly and very attentively, Fiona.
Yes.
How many staff? Are there more people or is it just the 3 of you?
Well, at the moment, it's just 3 of us.
Right.
And I think that the pandemic has changed that purely, and Brexit,
Right.
as we were talking about before, that it's not so straightforward now to have people
To
from
find people.
Europe. And also, I think due to the pandemic, we were a team of 5, and people also wanted to be back in their country. And I think that understandably, because all of our staff have been from the EU, I think that when the pandemic hit, people wanted to go back to the country where they came from because they couldn't see their families for a long time. But, it is how it is.
But it's important. I mean, 5 is still not huge.
No, it isn't huge. And we never have been. I think we've never been a studio of more than 6 people. But also we are really focusing on design. A lot of studios, if they're big studios, it's because they're doing interiors or they're doing other kind of consultancy work. We've really stuck to pure design in the way that I think of Jasper, for example, or Burlek, and, really focused on objects and things. And I think for that, it can only work with a small team if you want to do that quality of work.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, we're here to talk about materials and techniques. As I said in the intro, I've been aware of your work since 2003, which is nearly 20 years ago, my God. And one of the things that's generally intriguing about you as a duo, who both live and work together, obviously, is this sense of a kind of playful tension that goes on, that exists between the pair of you. I mean, would it be fair to say you come at a project, or the world really, through a different perspective?
Well, of course, I think at a very practical and factual level, I, of course, grew up in India and in a culture completely different from the UK or the industrialized West. India was still very much a developing economy when I was growing up, quite shut from the world in one respect, but also incredibly plural. And I've often talked about it, that, there are parts of where I grew up where we had a furniture factory next to a bicycle workshop, a paper cutting factory, a chai wala, temples, cows, so it was incredibly plural and intense. And also, when I say plural, not just architecturally, but also in terms of religion, languages, and influences from different parts of the world. And I grew up thinking that a Vespa was an Italian scooter, or so was a Fiat, or Art Deco was a Bombay architectural style. So I grew up thinking that's how the world is. It's plural, it's, mix of everything. And I think that voice is very strong in me. And it's really something that I try to bring in our design industry, which is still very Eurocentric and it's very focused. It has very strong kind of tenets of modernism, form follows function. And I feel that our industry is missing the fact that the world is big. And, we talk about design in terms of European design or maybe Japanese design. There are many other cultures who have a very different point of view in terms of material, the value of rituals. The world is much more layered. And design can be incredibly narrow, I feel, as well, because it's very defined. What is design? What is not? What is masculine? What is good design? And so I think I always try to challenge that.
So what did your parents do? I'm kind of intrigued as to how you became a designer, when you became interested in design. Were you from a design background?
I wasn't from a design background as such, although my father started his career in theatre.
Right.
And from my mum's side of the family, my grandfather was an aesthete. He used to collect objects, commission paintings. Our clothes were tailored. They were tailor-made, although I don't come from a wealthy background. You selected your fabric. You went to a tailor. You'd kind of imagine what you wanted to wear, and then you'd brief the person who was making the garment for you. So I think that making was very much a part of my upbringing.
Did you do any making, though?
I didn't do any making.
Right.
So that's interesting because, of course, India is also steeped in a caste system.
Yes.
And making is something that most middle-class kids from my kind of background don't do because you have people to make things. I definitely loved makers. And I think that also what drew me to Jonathan is because although I love makers, I'm not a maker myself. And I have this incredible, awe of people who can make things. And in India, we often talk about to know something is, okay, it's knowledge, but supreme knowledge is to know how to make something or how to do something. And I think that for me, that's where my love of making comes from.
That's all very sweet, Nipa, but really I think that your sort of motive was really to get me to make your Royal College of Art models.
This is how it all started.
I didn't see it at the time.
You were being manipulated.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because, I mean, Jonathan, you were born in Scotland. Your parents ran a soft toy making factory,
That's
so
right.
you were surrounded by cardboard boxes, I presume.
Well, yeah. Scotland was interesting because I grew up next to the factory.
Right.
And my parents, I consider them entrepreneurs because they started this business very much as a kind of small scale production of kits, soft toy kits, initially using sheep fleece to make these animals, which then turned into fabric kits that would be stamped from sheets of fabric. My mum designed the toys. She would draw animals, make them in clay,
Right.
make paper patterns to create the volume of those animals, and then they'd be turned into kits and then sold nationally initially, mainly to sort of John Lewis and haberdasheries up and down the country, because there was a kind of a culture of craft in the 70s. And a lot of these haberdasheries were looking for new product to sell other than wool for knitting. So the business took off. It did really well. Yes, there were lots of cardboard boxes around. I was living next to the factory, so I was the sort of sense of what is domestic space and industrial space. Those boundaries were really blurred. I mean, if you have two parents that are really dedicated to starting a business, then you're not going to get a huge amount of attention.
You had a lot of time by yourself. Is this what you're saying?
Well, yeah, I don't want the violins to come out just yet. We had to entertain ourselves, I would say. But we were surrounded by materials. And I don't know how responsible this was, but I was given a sharp blade at a really young age to cut.
How young?
I can't remember, but I was cutting
Too young.
sheets
Too young
of
is what
card.
you're
I was
saying.
cutting
Okay.
up boxes and making all kinds of things with brown tape and cardboard. So I've come not very far since then, I would say.
So when did you decide to be a cabinet maker? You were 16 when you started, I think.
Yes, well, I was 16. Well, I'd just done my GCSEs, and we had these things called an ISCO test, which was sort of to measure your aptitude and your ability in sort of different subjects. My academic record wasn't looking so great, but my manual dexterity was off the charts, and I was recommended to do an apprenticeship. I loved making things at school as well. I spent all my time in the kind of design lab, inventing things and making stuff. So it was quite obvious to me at that time that a 2-year course in making would be a really good thing to do instead of A-levels.
So you were making cabinets, furniture presumably. When did you decide that you wanted to design pieces instead of just make them?
So after 2 years of pushing the plane and cutting wood, I decided that it would be a good idea to add the design element. I was aware that there was a sort of something missing from my process. I was still sort of designing and inventing stuff to be made in wood, but I wanted to study design to focus on the quality of things that I was making in terms of ideas. So that's when I went to Bucks College to study design, 3-year course. But the making element never really left. And I would say now, although, I'm still making things, I'm not making the final article. That's the main difference. It's really to use making as a part of the process. It's a way of thinking now for me, a way of having ideas. And whereas Nipa achieves this through her drawings.
Through your drawing. Yeah, we're going to get into this because it's quite intriguing.
Oh, stop there then.
No, you don't have to. Just interjecting. But it's part of the contrast. I mean, Nipa, I'm quite keen. We've heard about Jonathan going to Bucks. I mean, you went to the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad, a school that was founded by Charles and Ray Eames in the 1960s. What was that like? Presumably it taught a kind of a Western sense of design. Or was that unfair? I mean, it's been quite controversial of late, I think.
What was interesting was that when Charles and Ray Eames wrote the manifesto for the design school, they were invited by the government of India, actually.
Right.
They were commissioned by the government of India to analyze and propose a solution to the kind of quality of manufactured products going down. So, what could the government do? And part of their recommendation was to form a design school. So what was interesting for me that Charles and Ray Eames traveled around India and really recorded India's crafts and way of doing things, and almost the design as a way of life. They have this beautiful film about the banana leaf and how it's considered primitive. And then their film kind of evolves into food being served in very ornate silver thalis. But actually, the banana leaf is the most sophisticated way to serve food and to use natural materials, for example. So I think although their proposal was very rooted in Indian culture, by the time the school was actually founded, there was a huge influence from Bauhaus and the Ulm school, and modernism definitely, was the kind of foundation of the school. And we were learning, as I've said often, learning about brown coffee makers. I'd never used that thing. I'd never seen it anywhere, in nobody's house that I went to.
Yeah.
Because, we made chai in stainless steel pots, putting all the ingredients together and boiling it. And of course, my furniture tutor, had studied furniture design in Denmark with Mogensen and all the kind of Danish masters. So that was another very strong influence in our work. But I think what we did have at college was this real sensitivity to Indian craft. So the college definitely made sure that all the students were aware of Indian craft skills, whether it was textiles or furniture or ceramics. So that was a kind of counterbalance to the European design that was being taught in school. And I saw that as a real kind of, what could you say, a disconnect between what I was learning and what design really was like in my country. And I think it hasn't changed very much. But of course, India is very different now. And, it's much more industrial. And a lot of the objects now that we use in the industrialized West are also part of people's everyday life. But I think it was an incredibly, for me, a transformation, of course, to be in this beautiful city with 600-year-old temples. But right opposite our college was the Kite Museum designed by Corbusier. Then Louis Kahn had designed IIM, the Management Institute.
Right, yeah.
Corbusier had built 3 or 4 buildings in this city, which we had
Didn't
access to.
Corbusier's assistant designed your
my aunt's house.
house.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, of course, and then my aunt was married into the Sarabhai family. So, we used to go to Villa Sarabhai. We used to go to the Kite Museum, and then also the Mill Owners Association building. So all these buildings were kind of scattered in the city. And yet my favorite part was the walled part of the city, where you had Ayurvedic physicians, you had textile makers. I think that's where I kind of really developed my love for craft, textiles. And, you had streets where you had a Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Jain, Christian home all on one street. And I think that for me was my idea of heaven, Grant. I thought this is what heaven must be like, with all this kind of juxtaposition, different influences, people, religion, architecture, making.
But I think kind of interestingly, you weren't studying textile design, you were studying industrial design.
That's right.
And you were quite resistant to colour and textiles for quite a long time, I think I'm right in saying.
Yes, absolutely. I think that I thought textiles is something that girls do, And of course, I was an industrial designer. I could make things. And, my work was quite minimal when I was at college. I didn't have a choice. It had to be. I did resist it for a long time, also because of the association of the kind of design women do. And I was really fighting that. And I did not want to fall into a cultural cliche or a professional cliche. But of course, when I left India also, I realized that it was a world that I really loved, the world that I was rejecting when I was growing up to a certain extent. The world of craft, of color, of textiles is something that I really grew up with. And I knew about it as well because, if you're an Indian person, your mom has this sari collection which uses different embroidery techniques, weaves, jacquard, and it's something that you just know intrinsically. But also I think that when Tefal, was the first company where when I went to meet them, they put a pile of thread on the table and they said, we want you to do our fabric and our colors. And I literally jumped because I thought, why are you asking me to do that? I want to do a chair for you. Jonathan wasn't in that meeting. They said, don't worry, we're also going to ask you to do a chair and furniture. And then I think I kind of thought, well, why not? Why not give it a go? And why do I have to resist, doing textiles and materials?
Yeah.
And I can say I'm actually really good at it, without kind of wanting to boast about it. It's a real strength. It comes naturally to me. It's work that I can do almost without thinking. It's in me.
Yes. I mean, fascinating, because obviously you weren't trained in it.
Yes.
Can we talk about, because you both met at the Royal College of Art doing product design. Did you always intend to go to London, to the Royal College, Nipa?
No, I didn't.
How did that happen?
Of course, that was because of Jasper.
Morrison, the
Jasper
furniture
Morrison.
designer.
Yes, and I remember in 1994, I went to see Jasper in his studio in London. His house and his studio were in Whitechapel. And of course, I went to see him. And there's a funny story around it. I don't know if you know, but I'd forgotten the house number. And I walked up and down the street. And he was ex-directory, of course, Jasper being Jasper. So I knew the street, but I didn't have his number, his house number. So I walked up and down the street, and it was the only house that didn't have lace curtains. It has a, white kind of glazed window.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So I thought, okay, this has to be Jasper's studio. And there I was. And I asked him for a job. I said, can I come and work with you? And he said, no, you're not ready. And he said, I recommend you go to the Royal College of Art. And I said, well, Jasper, I couldn't afford it. And he said to me, and this is also another time, Grant, that he said, well, once they give you admission, they will make sure that they will find funding for you. And he said, the college is really rich. Everything's changed in the UK.
Education has changed.
Education has changed. There was money for education then. And he also wrote a personal recommendation for me to the Royal College of Art. And
what about you, Jonathan? Were you always going to go after Bucks? Was that a natural progression?
Well, I could have really kind of gone off the rails at that point. But I have an uncle, Doshi Levien.
Yes, indeed. Very famous ceramics designer.
Yes. And he's been influential in a number of ways, I would say. Having been a furniture designer, furniture maker, I was always really inspired by his work, in that he was making sinks and bathrooms, a very kind of sculptural process. And I loved the fluid forms of his models and the things that he was making. And I always somehow wished that I could go from a more kind of constructional approach to making to a more sculptural approach in my work. And I think the Royal College of Art became that process through which I transferred my skills from furniture maker to kind of, what do we call it product design, I don't know, but a more sculptural approach.
What did your work look like at that point?
Well, before the Royal College of Art, I would say it was more kind of, things were made of wood, essentially. So they would be constructed. There would be a very strong spatial element and proportional element to the work. But I think I missed the sensuality of form that Robin had in his work that he was creating. And the Royal College of Art, the first year at the Royal College of Art, it was amazing in one respect, because we had people like Nipa coming from different countries, and a sort of influx of culture and experience was incredible. We had Brian Eno doing a project at one point in the school, and there were so many influences in the first year that I got quite kind of lost in terms of my own direction, what I was meant to be doing there. And it was really in the second year that I put everything together and realized that drawing, I had a love for drawing, and I just put all of the kind of lectures aside and just did drawing full time. And alongside that, I was sculpting pieces like chairs, lights. It was irrelevant really what I was creating. The point was that I was really interested in form and geometry. And I was particularly interested in the coming together of geometry and free form, and this idea of the interplay between a kind of cerebral, mathematic, geometric approach to design and the intuitive approach where you can evoke a feeling and emotion through your work, and the coming together of these opposites, if you like. So drawing on the one hand, and then making and sculpting on the other in the final year of the Royal College of Art. And I think that's where I really established my kind of direction, my love in design.
Talking about love, we need to touch on the fact that
we do, I guess,
living together. Yeah, it wasn't love at first sight when you're at the Royal College. There's
not for Nipa.
No,
it was something quite the opposite for Nipa. I think she was quite repulsed initially.
No, I wasn't. You were just such an
not
arrogant
for aesthetic,
show-off.
not for aesthetic reasons, but
Oh, he was arrogant.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
I was, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's quite interesting.
Just
I
for
wouldn't have imagined
well,
that.
just for the first day, and then I met Nipa.
Well, there is this story that gets told quite a lot, and just for people who maybe don't know your background that well, where Jonathan, you asked Nipa for critique on
that
a
was a
project that
mistake.
you'd done, and
Yes.
your reply, Nipa, was that you.
I was expecting, that's great, I love it, go ahead. But it was different, to what I expected. Nipa actually said, no, that's not. I think you could do a lot better than that. And I was resistant. I was quite defiant, convinced that I'd done this great thing. And Nipa said, well, I can't be your friend if I don't respect your work. So,
I'm intrigued. Did you then go away and completely rejig the? I mean, what were you
I
designing?
didn't really have a choice. 'Cause I kind of. No, I did. I pushed myself, and that was a great thing about having somebody so frank and honest and direct to have alongside you at college. I mean, how else are you going to grow? If people don't tell you what they think directly.
But I think also it's an English thing, right? You never really, I had no idea that, everything, you had to kind of say things politely or kind of say one thing and mean another thing. And, so I didn't and I still haven't learned the kind of art of
Moderation.
How to say what you want to say in the English way. And I think, of course, when I was at college in India, we would push each other, all my classmates. And I think it really annoyed me that Jonathan had made one thing. And just because he'd made it perfectly, he thought it was done. And it really made me cross that he thought that that's it, it's done. I'm like, it's not done. Can't you see? And it is true that I guess our relationship started by working together or being classmates.
We didn't actually work together.
No, but what I'm saying is it was rooted in being classmates together.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think it was really important for me that I respected his work. And I think it's true of me, generally speaking, that what we do, it's not that I judge what people do, but I have to respect what they do, because what you do really reflects also who you are. It's not that work is separate from who you are as a person and how you do something. So, of course, it just I knew that I couldn't be friends with someone like that, And it was great in some ways.
Sowed the seed of a great friendship, I would say, of respect. But it wasn't until much later, actually, that we started working together.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask that because you left the Royal College in 2000.
We left in 97.
Oh, you left in 97.
Yes.
Sorry, and you
2000
formed the
when we
studio in 2000.
That's correct.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. But you'd worked for David Chipperfield. You'd been at SCP. You'd gone back to India for a while.
That's right.
And Jonathan, you'd worked at Ross Lovegrove's
Yes.
studio. And I'm wondering what you picked up in that 3-year period that you then brought in when you got back together to work.
Of course, I was trying to go as far away from furniture making design as I could. So I landed on my feet with Ross Lovegrove and his studio. He was creating a diverse range of projects for Japan Airlines, Tag Heuer. So it was perfect for me. It was where I wanted to be in terms of designing more sculptural pieces and focusing on this love of form and material that I'd developed at the Royal College of Art. And to be able to apply that within an industrial, commercial context, I think was really great for me. I would say that after 3 years at Ross's studio, I was ready for something else. And I always wanted to start my own practice. That's, there was no doubt there. Maybe that comes from my parents and their process of starting a business. I have no idea, but I was sure that I wanted to have my own business. But I think that I realized that if I was to go out there and work as a designer on my own, there'd be something missing, I think. I really felt that there were enough designers who could do the same kind of work that I could do. And I really felt that with Nipa, we could make a more layered approach together and a more layered offering in our work if we work together, for reasons that, there's the cultural element and there's far more to offer if we worked as a partnership. So that came in 2000 when we decided to work together.
So you started working together before you started dating, in other words? Or was it at
No,
the same
we were
time?
at college together. So we were in college from 95 to 97. And we actually got together right at the end of college.
Ah, okay.
And it's interesting because, of course, Jonathan got a job straight away when he graduated from college. And, I cleaned for friends, and then I got an internship working at SCP. And then Jasper also recommended me to David Chipperfield's studio. So, Jasper's kind of helped me in also kind of helping me get work and recommending me to David. But I think that what I learned, of course, it was very hard, Grant, and to talk about it sort of now, that first of all, to be a woman in design, to be from India, not really having permission to work in the UK. So it was very, very hard to actually also start my career, and starting really, even after the Royal College, starting really at the bottom, so to speak. Of course, if I was in India, I would have got a really good job straight away. And creatively, there was a lot more freedom to an extent. But I think what I really learned, especially, working at, I don't want to say SCP in particular, but I think because I was doing production drawings and things like that, I learned kind of working on other people's designs. And I think that's really humbling. And I was very happy to do technical drawings for whether it was Jasper's project or Gritchich or Terence Woodgate, getting prizes and things like that. But of course, it was not at all creative. And I think at Chipperfield, what I really learned was to work in a big team. And it's one of those studios where men and women were treated completely equally.
Right.
So I think that's something I really enjoyed. There were some really strong men and women, young men and women working in the team. I have some friends that I made that are my friends now. The business aspect of it, the fact that an architecture project that was started when I was there is still, some of the projects are still going on. And, I remember he started working on the Neue Museum, for example. And so I think what I loved working for other people was, of course, the other people that I met, but also it taught me about business, and it taught me about architecture and spaces and, other things that I wouldn't have learned if I was working in a normal design studio.
Did you face prejudice then because you're a woman, because you were from India?
Of course. I mean, really terrible prejudice, and it's not maybe a moment to talk about it in any detail or to kind of call out people. But I think I was puzzled, actually, because I grew up in India and I didn't face racism. I grew up in my own culture with my own people. So I think at that point, I didn't even realize, I was just puzzled that why couldn't I get jobs, or why I wasn't as successful as Jonathan even. I felt that there was a barrier, but I couldn't figure out what the barrier was. Because I hadn't grown up in the UK, I didn't even know what racism was unless it was overt. Sometimes it was overt, and you kind of think stupid people. But, there was a lot of prejudice which was so undercover that you couldn't point your finger and say that's prejudice, because I wasn't looking for it and I hadn't experienced it before. And I think that the reason we started working together in some ways, because Jonathan was getting the projects and I thought, okay, I'll just help him. So in some ways, I think for me, it was just, I was happy to work on projects that he had with Tom Dixon, for example, working with Habitat and things like that. And I think that it was very humbling, actually, I think, for me to work in a foreign country, because you completely lose your status as an immigrant and as a woman.
But very quickly, Nipa, we did, sorry to interrupt, but we did come to the Tefal project that Grant mentioned earlier.
Yes.
And I think that was a really decisive moment for us when we managed to kind of bring together the sort of cultural knowledge with the design experience that we'd both had. We made a proposal. We used to write letters and proposals every day. We used to take a day over crafting these proposals. And a lot of them just went into what I call the black hole because nothing came back. But we'd written a really great proposal to Jackie Moulin at Tefal. And we'd pointed out, various observations in India relating to cuisine and food culture, and proposed that we combine Tefal's expertise in manufacture with a more kind of culturally attuned sensitivity to Indian cuisine and create a new collection directly and specifically for India that was becoming more important as a global commercial
market
arena,
or economy.
market, yeah, whatever. And I would say that's the first time where we actually really brought our talents and experience together.
I mean, it's quite interesting to talk about that project very briefly, because I remember seeing it for the first time and it gave me quite a start, if I'm honest with you. It seemed to come out of nowhere. There was nobody else doing work like it at that particular point in time, as far as I can remember. I mean, did you feel as if you were going out on a limb?
Actually, it was so exciting to work on that project because I remember it was an opportunity almost to have a new visual language in design. Apart from all the cultural intelligence and the research that went into the product, it was an opportunity to really mix things up and to create a new language which was truly hybrid. And it was really a coming together of different worlds because you have the really high technology of Tefal. They have a factory with 3,000 people and completely industrial. And yet everything to do with material intelligence, the cultural references, the shapes, it felt radical, even when we were doing it, and exciting at the same time. And I do feel that when we also did the patterns on the base, in a small way, I think it also kind of set a new way of looking at design and this kind of plurality and cultural hybridity, which is not a great word, but it was a new language, I felt. And that language was us.
Talking about you, obviously, I mean, just talk about your work. There's always a temptation, I'm sure I have done it, to write about you as a duo in kind of binary terms. Nipa, arguably more of a talker, born and raised in India, so naturally has this innate understanding of colour and pattern. Jonathan, a bit more reserved, British, provides a kind of three-dimensional form and the making chops. I mean, is it that simple in terms of the way
Johnny's not reserved. Not at all. It's interesting because I think that, of course, I love talking about ideas, but I think actually I'm harder to kind of be friends with, so to speak. So I think maybe I have that kind of reserve, which is supposed to be English reserve, but I don't think it's that binary, actually. I would say that we are both creative. So that's kind of, so it's not like one is creative and one is doing production. I think we are both creative and we both have a strong point of view. So I think that also kind of goes back to the fact that's why also projects take longer because, it's kind of two people working on something. I don't know if it's constantly arguing. It's not that. It's again not as simple as that.
Fiona in the background's just smiling, just so you know.
But I think that it isn't binary at all. I think that often some projects that you might think that might be more coming from Jonathan, but it could be that I've done a sketch in my book or Jonathan's made something and then I've done a drawing of that in my book. So it's, sometimes when the piece is done, we don't really know where the ideas come from. And I think that's really exciting as well, that in the end, you don't know when exactly the idea happened.
And if there is any ambiguity, you do try and take claim.
Yeah, it's always my idea.
Is that because you draw and you make, and so you can sign you sign the sketchbook?
Well, Nipa's drawings have become quite a thing, I would say.
They're very beautiful,
and they are, stunning. What I admire about Nipa's process is that her drawings really reflect the love with which she's having, ideas and working with color and form. And for me, my drawings are very schematic and kind of wiry and kind of messy. So they never get published.
I don't know if it's that.
But, I make
you
things.
Them,
so, well, yes, I do.
John just throws his drawings.
But for me, they're just a sort of stepping stone, really, towards what I'm trying to make. They are very schematic, and it's just a one little sketch, and then I'm off back to making something because it just sets off the idea for me, the sketch. Whereas for Nipa, it's a sort of piece in itself. It's a sort of immersive process through which she kind of just conjures the flavor and the visual identity of a piece, and the whole kind of the personality comes through in those drawings.
Or the proportion.
All of that.
It's a kind of...
For me, that has to happen through making. And if there is one sort of definitive difference and one sort of binary observation or reality there, it's that I invest time in making and Nipa invests her time in her drawings.
I mean, can we talk about the making?
We can, yeah.
And cardboard.
Cardboard, yeah.
And making these, which we've alluded to already, that you make these prototypes in cardboard. What is it about cardboard as a material? Why do you find it so fascinating to prototype, to make in?
Well, I kind of switch between different mediums depending on what I'm creating. And I was making things in foam and sculpting things in foam for a long period. And then I realized that actually for making large sort of spatial objects like chairs, you've got to take off a lot of material before you actually describe what it is that you're trying to create. Whereas cardboard, on the other hand, allows you very quickly to make a space or to kind of describe a space through pattern cutting. And I think that cardboard starts life as this sort of stiff, flat, two-dimensional surface. And then by the time I've worked with it, it becomes this kind of pliable, plastic, fluid material, quite unlike cardboard that you might imagine. And this is through a process of darting, taping, rolling. I pulverize it and turn it into this sort of three-dimensional sculptural piece that becomes a chair or a light. So I love that transformation from, the two-dimensional into the three-dimensional object. I'm really into that.
I mean, you can see in the studio a lot of our Earth to Sky mock-ups are made in card. The mirror mock-up is also made in card. The paper planes mock-up, impossible wood, cupboards. And we've got a whole storage full of our cardboard mock-ups as well.
But materials, they bring their own language to the object that you're creating. So, at the moment I'm really into working with clay because I need to work on more sort of sophisticated form language, and that requires more of a sculpted approach. Card is interesting because all you need to do is make a dart in the card, join it, and then the card, through its own natural tension, describes the form for you. So I love that idea that you're partially in control of the outcome, but the material is giving you the rest of the information. It's the material is describing what it needs to be. And that means that for a lot of our work, we're able to do pieces that actually look quite kind of radical in their appearance, but natural at the same time. And they feel natural because it's the material that has defined the form through its kind of natural properties and the way that it wants to bend or fold, or
the tension in the
tension
material.
in the
But
material.
even when it's changed into a different material when it's finally manufactured.
Yes, that's where Fiona comes in.
But you never realised you'd have a cameo role in this. Fiona.
But also, I think that's the kind of course, we are translating these pieces into three-dimensional, and then you're putting it on the computer. And I think the challenge is, how do you keep that kind of essence? Because, of course, the piece is not made in card, right? Or any other, or wire that we've used. But I think what's interesting is the tension that you get when you work with materials, the lines that you get because of how the material wants to move. And then we try to translate that into 3D. And then there's the additional kind of process of it being made in the real material. But I think the ideas are starting from making or drawing. And it doesn't start on the computer is what we're trying to say.
Absolutely.
And I think that it's a kind of back and forth process, because when you start to put these pieces in production, the final material also has its own properties. So then you kind of go back to the mock-up, drawing, mock-up. So it's like a sofa, for example, you can never make it on the computer, because the fabric and the foam behaves in a certain way. And you only find that out when you make the mock-up, or the company you're working with make the prototype.
Yeah, the quilt-on sofa that we designed for Hay, we essentially asked them to send us a pile of wood and foam and some stitched fabric, and we made the prototype in the studio pretty much with, very basic line drawings and measurements initially. But it was working on the project, it was working on the piece, and I really believe that brought a lot to it.
Yeah.
Final identity.
Yeah. Well, look, we left your career at about 2003.
Yeah.
You've been making cookware for Tefal. Subsequently, I remember you doing an exhibition design for the Welcome collection. But I guess the next big break came in 2007 when you did these extraordinary, colourful daybeds entitled Chapois for the Italian manufacturer Moroso. How important was Moroso to your career? And I guess specifically Patrizia?
Up till then, of course, we launched a collection with Tefal. We'd done some work with Habitat as well. And then we also did My World for Experimenter, which was in Lisbon.
Lisbon, yeah.
And I think that what we realized is, of course, that we needed to work with an Italian company, because the reach of an Italian design-led companies, and they're very experimental in their work. And I remember reading an article about Patrizia Moroso, And I said to Jonathan, if there's one Italian company that I think will be open to our work, it'll be Moroso, because you have to also remember that Italian design was still very much in the late 90s, early 2000, very minimal, very clean. And I remember Patrizia Moroso had started working with Todd Bunche, with Patrizia Urquiola. So it felt like it was a company which was open to different approaches. So we wrote to Patrizia, and she received this beautiful package from us. And Wallpaper had awarded us Best Breakthrough Designers in 2006, 2007. So she received the magazine and she received our package, so to speak. And, she decided to come to London. And we'd worked on the charpoy as a kind of proposal for the My World project. And she said, let's make a collection out of this.
You have to tell Grant about the charpoy project, what it involved.
So, of course, the project was a daybed with the game embroidered on it. And the mattress was completely hand embroidered in India in my aunt's workshop. And she had a workshop of about 50 to 60 master craftspeople making things for Issey Miyake, for Hermes, incredibly beautifully handmade things. And then the base was, of course, made by Moroso in Italy. And it was a series of 4 daybeds that we did using this game of chopar, which is based on the mythical, what do you call it?
Like chess, basically.
It's like chess. That's where chess comes from. And in the Mahabharata, the Indian epic, it led to the big war because, money was lost playing chopar.
But the idea of placing this game or weaving this game into the charpoy was to, it was a story about the charpoy or the daybed is a place for kind of a collaboration. It was actually originally that piece was a mattress in the installation we did, like Nipa was saying, for Lisbon Biennale, where we were exploring this idea of the shop, the Indian shop, where you walk in, take off your sandals, walk into the shop. There are many other people in the shop with you. You sit on a mattress on the floor, talk to the craftsperson or the jeweler or wherever
who's making
your piece. And this idea that it was as much about a kind of a social interaction as it was a commercial exchange. And in the same shop, you might have a matelot, a terracotta water vessel, and terracotta cools water through the evaporative process by about 14 degrees. So we were really interested in how aspects of Indian culture could be kind of brought into the kind of European design context. So that's how the charpoy was born, really. It was this space where the people in the shop would talk to each other and have a social interaction, as well as an interaction with the shopkeeper.
And it was the meeting of Indian craft and Italian, slightly more industrial craft, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah. Eventually, yes.
I think also it was so rooted in making and hand making and craft. And I think in the context of Salone del Mobile and the fair, it just felt so radical and so new to have these 4 pieces that were beautifully embroidered by master craftswomen in India, along with Italian industrial production. And all the craftspeople and all the makers had embroidered their name on each piece. And, it was something quite different.
Coming back to your question, how important was that work with Moroso? It was essential because until then, we were creating all of this work, having these ideas about how to combine culture and design. But I wouldn't say that it was gaining any traction as such. And what we needed was a kind of an international platform to present these ideas and our way of thinking. And Patrizia Moroso gave us that. She embraced it.
Did it change the trajectory of your career? Because back in that first interview that I read, which you did in Blueprint in 2003, and you've alluded to it here, is you talked about helping companies enter the Asian market. But since 2007, it seems to me you've concentrated in working at the higher end of the design world, Moroso, B&B Italia, Tefal, BD Barcelona, Hey, Kvadrat. You did do a collection for John Lewis.
That's true.
But I'm interested in why you did that.
Yes, what's interesting and what you've touched on there is that, with the Tefal collection, for example, we did propose to Tefal that we design pieces that are manufactured for the Indian market. But the project that eventually happened was almost the reverse. They came back and said, well, customers in Europe are really interested in cuisine from around the world. So how can we import that culture to the European environment or market? It's almost like the reverse has happened from that initial concept. Still valid, still an exchange, and still very much what we want to do.
But I think going back to your question, we did write to a lot of Indian companies as well, whether it's Bajaj who makes scooters and, many other Indian companies to say, well, why don't you design products that are kind of rooted in Indian culture, for example? And of course, you also have to remember we worked with all these kind of what you say high-end design companies. What you need for design is you need a culture in the company also to create design. And a lot of big companies don't have that culture. And I mean, Apple and few other companies are an exception that they're really using design. Most companies are not interested in design, big manufacturers. And what we realized is that design is a very small part of changing the culture of a company. A company also has to know how to sell design, how to develop it, how to do research. So I think in the end, we've ended up working with companies which have a very strong design culture.
Right.
And they happen to be companies, that are high end. But within high end, we're also working with Hay, and then we are doing gallery pieces for Kreo. And I think that, of course, our products are not mass, although they are industrially manufactured, they're not mass produced. Even if I look at the sofa we've done for Hay or the pieces we've done for Hay. But what I love about the work that we do is that I also see that it keeps craftsmanship alive. And I think when people say, well, I look at companies like Moroso, B&B Italia, Hay, BD, Tefal, they're really invested in making. And, they really care about the people who are working in their factories. And the people who are working in their factories are coming from the neighborhood. They are not displaced people who are looking for a job outside of the community that they grew up in. So I think for me, that's a very important aspect of working with these companies, is that they're rooted in making, these companies.
Yeah. I'm going to go back to John Lewis because I'm intrigued. Was that an attempt to find a different market?
No, what happened there is that, we worked solely in Europe and we didn't have one client in the UK. And we really liked the idea of just walking down the road and having a meeting instead of having to fly off somewhere. It was as simple as that. And we thought, who can we work with who's based here in London and we can get some kind of dialogue going and have, a creative discussion. So John Lewis is can we say institution?
Yeah, we can. Let's call it an institution.
Yeah. So we saw this opportunity to do a whole collection for them. We called it Open Home. It was looking at how, lifestyle at home is kind of becoming more blurred, the boundaries between different living spaces, between cooking, eating, living, lounging. And we wanted to create this environment of objects that could support that way of life. And so we did.
We're coming to the end of our time. So last couple of questions. Going back to that original 2003 interview at Blueprint, I mean, Nipa, you said that you wanted to challenge the cliched stereotyping of India, which is limited to a stylistic parody of Bollywood kitsch and curry houses. I'm trying to represent my culture in all its complexity and sophistication. So we're nearly 20 years on. Do you feel you've done that?
I think I have. And I think that you can see that in the work that we've done is, I always say that there are more than 1 billion Indian people. So, I'm not the only one who's a carrier of Indian culture, so to speak, but it's how you translate what you know and how do you take the influences and kind of play with it. And so I think our work doesn't look Indian, but you also know that there is a voice from somewhere else. And I think that it was very important for me that people understand India is not just one thing. It's not just ancient or traditional. It has a huge culture of plurality and modernity. And it's something that I think reflects in our work.
Something I definitely should have asked, which I haven't, but I'm going to now, is when you're working with a manufacturer, are there projects that are more Jonathan, more Nipa? I mean, I'm guessing when you look at Kvadrat, I'm guessing Nipa, that's more you than Jonathan, but and does it work
Correct.
the other way around?
I would say it's the only kind of area in which I think the color work is definitely coming from me, the color and the textile work. And yet Jonathan is involved in the kind of editing or kind of, almost being the objective eye when it comes to the project. but it's something I do. The color and the materials, definitely.
We're dedicating a whole new space to that work. In fact, we're opening up the studio next door to be a color lab.
Interesting.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's a really important aspect of our work. It's become so strong.
That was going to be my final question, which is future plans. So Color Lab is one thing that you're doing. Yeah. When is that going to happen?
Tomorrow.
Beginning of April. Beginning of April. But I think we also the Color Lab is also going to be a space where, it's going to kind of develop also as a salon space. We want to have events or have talks. So I think, especially after the pandemic, I feel like it's time to kind of welcome people back into our world and also connect with the local London, where we live. And there's so many incredible creative people in London as well. So somehow make it an interactive space as well.
So people will be able to come up and see you talk about colour, and this is the notion, or there'll be other
not just
guest
about
speakers?
colours, guest speakers. Of course, it'll primarily be a colour lab, and to really develop that side of our work more. Although we do a lot of it, it's something that not many people know about. The amount of colour and material research that we actually are involved in, and then also to have it as another space to have talks and to have events to show new work, and more public facing, I suppose.
Very good. Well, that's a lovely, lovely place to leave it. Jonathan, Nipa, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Grant.
Thank you.
And to discover more about Nipa and Jonathan, go to doshilevien.com. As ever, there are images from the interviews on my Instagram page, Grant on Design. And you can find all the podcasts that I've done, sign up to my newsletter, and lots of other stuff at grantondesign.com. Finally, and this is really important too, if you've enjoyed listening and want to see this podcast flourish, then please rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this from. And it would make me incredibly happy if you went to my Patreon page and made a pledge at patreon.com/Material Matters. For as little as £2.50 a month, you can receive exclusive posts, blogs, and thoughts from yours truly, as well as getting access to each episode before it's published to the wider world. Material Matters is a completely independent concern, and any help you can offer would be hugely appreciated. Ultimately, you'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft, and design to a whole new audience. Thanks very much for listening.